Hello. Keep your things here. Keep your things here. Good evening, everybody. I am Aradhya Bharadwaj from Sociology Unit of IEG. Today evening, on behalf of Institute of Economic Growth, I feel privileged to welcome you all on this very important occasion when we would have opportunity to listen Professor James Heckman's distinguished lecture on the economics and the econometrics of human development. May I request Honorable Dr. Ajay Chibbar, Director General of Independent Evaluation Office, Government of India, to kindly occupy the chair on the dais. Please, Dr. Ajay Chibbar. Thank you, sir. Now I request Professor James Heckman, Nobel Laureate in Economics and Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor of Economics, University of Chicago, and Professor Manoj Panda, Director of IG, to take their seats on the dais. Thank you, sir. Respected Dr. Chibbar, Honorable Professor James Heckman, Professor Manoj Panda, galaxy of distinguished scholars and dear friends. Once again, I welcome you all. Now, without taking much of your time, I request Dr. Chibbar to take the charge of the event and proceed further. Please, Dr. Ajay Chibbar.
Professor Heckman, Chibbar, Mrs. Heckman, distinguished guests and colleagues. It is indeed a great pleasure to extend a hearty welcome to Professor James Heckman for kindly accepting our invitation to give a distinguished lecture on this occasion. I'm not, going to introduce Professor Heckman. Everybody knows about him. I'll only say one or two things that in the past, the Institute has benefited from the visit of distinguished scholars. Among them, I might mention a few Nobel laureates, Professor Klein, Professor Ostrom, and of course, Professor Sen. Now, the work that Professor Heckman does, one of his co-authors had visited the institute a few months ago, Dr. Lakshmi Rao, and he had presented one of his papers on intergenerational long-term effect of preschool, and around that time we had requested him that we had written to Professor Heckman. We knew that he would be coming to Delhi that time for inauguration of the University of Chicago Center, and when I told Lakshmi in the seminar, after going back, he requested him to consider giving the lecture at IEG. It's also befitting that Dr. Ajay Chivar, Director General of the newly constituted Independent Evaluation Office, has agreed to chair on this occasion. He was Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and in that capacity, he monitored the Human Development Index in several countries, and also he was instrumental in preparation of the Human Development Reports across the world. We are indeed happy, sir, to welcome you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Manoj Panda. Well, good evening, everybody, and it's a great honor and pleasure to have such a famous Nobel Prize-winning economist, Professor James Heckman, with us today. He has been a pioneer in the development of human capital theory, and more important, in rigorous empirical and econometric work on understanding the costs and benefits of policies and programs for human capital development and growth. It's therefore very appropriate that he speaks today at India's premier think tank, the Institute for Economic Growth. And thank you, Professor Manoj Panda, for this evening and for this talk. I am particularly pleased to chair this talk because, as some of you may just heard, we have recently launched the Independent Evaluation Office of India with a theme, Independent Evaluation for Informed Policy Making and Better Outcomes. I was therefore very especially pleased to read in Professor Heckman's work a very strong pitch for rigorous empirical evaluation in a cost-benefit framework. Quote him, "There is no shortage of policy proposals, but there is a shortage of empirical evidence on the efficacy of such policies." Those of us in India will really know how that works here. And he goes on to add that no common framework has been used to evaluate them. And to me, I think this is very critical because a cost-benefit framework allows one to ask what is the competing use of those resources. Professor Heckman's lifetime work, and by no means do I mean that his lifetime work is over, is amazing for its impact not only on economics, but also in statistics and in other social sciences. For those who have been involved in empirical and econometric work and rigorous evaluation, the Heckman correction for self-selection bias in sample surveys is widely known and for which Professor Heckman so deservedly received the Nobel Prize in 2000. We now use techniques he pioneered so routinely in any analysis of large data sets. But we also now have a much better understanding of self-selection bias, but also of other issues that confront empirical research, such as confounding, spillover, and contamination. Professor Heckman's work, like those of many great researchers, amazes with its laser-like logic and clarity. But what distinguishes him is the empirical rigor which he brings to bear to prove his thinking and intuition. He received his Nobel Prize, as I said, for the Heckman correction, but is now blazing the research and policy world with the Heckman equation, providing solutions for better education, health outcomes, less crime and poverty, and greater economic prosperity. The key to his work is a more holistic life cycle approach that argues human capital development, which is the key to long-term prosperity and economic growth, is not just about schooling, but is produced over a life cycle in the family, in school, and at work. Early investment, he emphasizes, leads to better returns because returns accumulate over a longer life cycle, but also because it enhances the productivity of later investments. Professor Heckman's work is not abstract, but comes from deep concern over the decline in educational attainment in the US with rising inequality, poverty, and crime. So we are extremely honored, Professor Heckman, that we have you here with us. And I also hope that now that Professor Heckman hasn't done much work on India before this, so we also hope to entice him to come and do more work on India. Of course, we would need to have better data so that he could apply his mind to some of our problems. But now that the University of Chicago has arrived in Delhi, we hope that we will get to see more of Professor Heckman with us and more of his intellect and energy to help us solve some of our problems. Thank you, Professor Heckman. Now, the floor is yours.
Have a presentation. There are no candidates presentation, but I'm very grateful. Okay, very good. So thank you very much, Dr. Chibra, for the kind introduction, for the invitation to this economic growth. As you say, I have not written much on India. I've worked with many Indian economists and been benefited greatly, most prominently probably P. and Srinivasa, but also Professor B.K. Chetty and many others over my lifetime. And I've always followed India closely. Of course, Amartya Sen I know quite well, and we interact on these issues. It came as a surprise to me, though, preparing for the lecture and in coming to India, to realize that their quality of data on many important topics is not so good. In many cases, the data don't exist. And to me, that was very surprising because during my whole undergraduate education, graduate education, leading scholars in statistics, economics were from India. They pioneered, of course, the application of experiments to data. People like P.C. Mahalanobis and, of course, all the great work from that generation, C.R. Rao. So it came as a little bit of a surprise that somehow the empirical work wasn't keeping up with the quality of statistics. So I hope something going forward can be done about that. I'm not sure just the University of Chicago opening a center is going to do it, but let me talk about it. What I want to talk about today is the economics and econometrics of human development. And this has several themes that I think will resonate with people here at the IEG. And let me start off by just talking about what is a persistent problem. And here, this may be my first questionable why. So I want to be challenged. I hope to come here to learn, not just to lecture. But we know that inequality is a serious issue. People like Sen and others, big debates between Sen and Bhagwati and many others on exactly the nature of inequality in India. But there's also a lot of debate going on in the U.S. and around the world on the importance of intergenerational transmission of poverty. And so there's recently been pioneered the idea of what's called the Great Gatsby curve. That term was pioneered by, was mentioned by Alan Kruger when he was working for President Obama. But it's basically just this relationship between the income in a current generation and the income of the parents of the previous generation. And there's a whole statistical literature about how you can create this and what the actual relationship is. But if you look at this curve, which plots the figures for different countries, I've circled India, and I'm not entirely sure the Indian data are correct. So that's why I don't want to put it forward as a truth, but it's a provisional hypothesis. But what this shows is, as a general matter, this intergenerational elasticity, which is this coefficient beta, which is how much current income of the parents affects current income of the children of those parents, how much that beta varies depending on the level of income inequality in a country. So, for example, a very strong relationship is found if we look at the inequality measured by a Gini coefficient, that the higher the inequality in the cross-section across countries, it seems like the higher the inequality in terms of intergenerational transmission. A higher value of beta is associated with more dependence on the accident of birth, on family origin. And a lower value of beta is associated with more mobility, that people born poor can escape poverty. And so you look at some of the countries in Europe, for example, Denmark, Norway. I guess this works as pointers. Try it. Oops. Yes, it does. So if you look down here on this graph, you'll see a strong relationship. These are countries with very low income inequality. This is after tax and transfer income inequality, and it's family income. And this is the intergenerational elasticity. You can see that countries that generally have low income inequality, measured cross-sectionally across households, generally have a lower value of beta, suggesting economic opportunity is greater for the children. But the question that, so mobility possibilities are higher. Now, if you look at India in this graph, and this is why I'm a little bit uncertain, because I know there isn't such good data on the cross-sectional income inequality. So the Gini coefficient is something that we don't have much data on in India. So this is a provisional figure that I picked out of the literature. And it's from a paper by Hanat Koskva that was put out in 2013. But I circled it because I want to know actually whether or not that's a valid number, probably a better number than I. So I don't want to necessarily put India on the list, but you can see that very high inequality countries like Brazil and China generally have lower intergenerational elasticities or higher beta. So basically you're finding more dependence on the accident of birth. But the question I want to talk about today is, how do we interpret this relationship? What's the economic policy interpretation? So it's exactly as Dr. Chibber was saying. We have these empirical relationships, but what should we make of this relationship? What causes? Is there a causal association? The reason why I raise this is that many people say that income inequality per se is a source of this high value of beta. That we see that if we get the beta itself would depend on this. But so income inequality would be related. And the argument is very simple. You can say, well, unequal societies, although these are conceptually different ideas, unequal societies may also be societies with some very poor people, very rich people. There are many poor people, absolutely. I mean, inequality, the Gini coefficient doesn't really give us a measure of absolute poverty. So this isn't a measure of a poverty count. This is just a measure of inequality. So one argument, which may be flawed, but may be applicable in India, I don't know, is that really because you have very, very many poor people and you have a relatively high level of inequality, people would say maybe you have a greater inequality than this graph would suggest, that maybe family income and policies that promote equality and that promote family income transfers could be a very effective strategy. But there is a serious interpretive issue. And the interpretive issue is exactly what is the basis for this relationship. So there's a huge literature on this, and I'll just tap on this, and I only have an hour or so, and I'll try to sketch some of the main ideas. But the main problem that has to do with this is family income stands for many different things. Clearly, it's family transfer. It's income transfer, the ability of resources. But it's also related to things like education of the parents, which is not the same as income. It's related to various measures of parental advantage. And it's also related to genes. And so there's an issue about exactly what this relationship means and what we should make of it in terms of public policy. So I want to talk about this, but I should warn you that all of my information, most of my data, come from countries in Western Europe or the United States. So the question is, should there be policies taken to lower this IGE? IGE is this low value of beta. So the question is, should we try to take policies to alleviate this? And what form should they take? Now there's a standing model out there, one by my colleague Gary Becker, with a student of his done some 30 years ago, Nigel Tomes, and more recently Gary Sola, who is at Michigan State. And if you look at the causes, there are some relationships suggesting, of course, that the higher the heritability. So if we imagine there's a genetic factor that smart people have more income, they pass their genes on to their children, and therefore their children have higher income, that beta goes up with heritability. We can also imagine if some parental environments are actually more efficient in investing in their children, giving their children necessary life skills, beta would go up if there's inequality among those environments. Now, more controversial, but a special case, and I won't go into the mechanics, it's in the companion paper, which I'll make available to anybody who's interested, that if we have inequality in wages in a cross-section, that beta goes up. So many people say, that means we should reduce income inequality, and that would promote social mobility. And then, of course, public provision of investment. The higher the public provision of investment, the higher the value of beta. And so the point is if you have a very unequal society, so the rich are getting good schooling, but the poor are not, the rich are getting good health, but the poor are not, then beta would go up. So that's the general model. But we also know as a purely statistical matter that the more heterogeneity there is across units, the greater the estimated beta. So this IGE, this coefficient of beta, is really a function of having to control for the amount of heterogeneity in the literature. So there's a lot of literature that's looked at the main findings, and I don't want to go over every single finding in the literature, but I want to talk about a few points in the literature. And let me just summarize that literature very briefly, if I may. And the structure that is prevalent has to do with the notion that household decision-making and household decisions play an increasingly important role. And the question then becomes, is the causal relationship coming from the relationship between the empirical, between the actual inequality of income translating into the resources invested in the children, or some of these other family mechanisms? And economists, of course, like to talk about constraints. And in particular, there have been three constraints that have received the most attention. People with less income are constrained. That's obvious, but that is a constraint. But there's also issues about liquidity constraints within a given lifetime. And so that suggests a kind of avenue of public policy in which people who can't borrow against their own future income, much less the income of their children, would find themselves constrained. And it suggests a kind of public policy evaluation where we might think of opening credit markets and perfecting the limitations, and perfecting credit markets so that we can have more resources transferred and efficient investments could be made. That's an issue. But there is also a fundamental constraint, and the fundamental constraint that many people wouldn't call it a constraint, but it is a constraint, and that is the accident of birth. Literally, children can't protect against having a good parent or a bad parent, a rich parent or a poor parent. And so there is a fundamental constraint of the accident of birth. Now there is a model, there actually is a model that is been put forward that suggests that if we have a situation in which parents could, children could shop for their parents or fully insure against the accident of birth, then these kinds of considerations would vanish and the beta would be very low. But of course we know that that's a facetious suggestion and we can't really do much about that. So the question becomes, what is the nature of the relationship? What can we know about it? What are the mechanisms producing this? Well, what we find in the literature, and this is literature now from the United States, and my bet is that it's even more pronounced in India. A central finding in the literature that if you look at lifetime income inequality, that about 50% of the inequality in earnings of men, been looking more at men than women, but there's similar results for women, but less well studied, that about 50% of lifetime inequality would be due to factors that are in place and are known by people by the time they're 18 years of age. That would include the education they have, would include their ability, it would include all the investments the family make in their children. But the question then becomes, and of course there's a huge role for public policies after people turn 18. There's a role for macro policy, there's a role for trade, so there certainly is a large role. I simply don't know what the number would be for India, but I think it's very plausible that it would be at least 50%. Early life conditions matter. And if you look at the kind of inequality that we see in Indian society in terms of access to education, I would think that number might be even higher than 50%. But the question is, what are the correlates? My own view is that it's very hard to look for genes. I mean, 100 years ago, people looked for genetic explanations for beta, but that's not plausible. Not when you look across this variation across countries. Genetic stocks are pretty much the same. We differ, different groups differ, but I don't think we can blame genes or say that variations across countries in terms of genetic stock has much of a difference. Quality of schooling and the level of schooling plays a very important role. And the level of parenting is also playing an important role. Again, when we look at the structure of this knowledge even in the societies that I'm familiar with. And there's also a question about the access to credit markets, the access that individuals have to public institutions. And then finally, there's a question about parental preferences. So even if we did transfer money, even if resources were freely available, how could we actually find the important role of parental preferences? Some parents are more altruistic than others. Some are more paternalistic. Exactly how does the family duplicate itself? How does it impress itself in producing inequality? And so the real question is, what should we do? There's a real question is, should we even worry about the IGE? Should we even worry about the fact that it's high in some countries and low in another? And what policies we should take? So this is why I want to address these questions and consider what we know. Here's an example, though, in the U.S. for disadvantaged populations versus advantaged populations. And one of the major themes of this lecture and a lot of my recent work has been the importance of the early years in creating a base of skill that would affect life throughout the whole life cycle. So for example, when we look at disadvantaged families, these are children who would be in the most disadvantaged groups. This is now in the United States. And we look at the quality of family environment and the nature of parenting. What we see is, among the most disadvantaged people, the actual number of words that a child hears in a given hour is about 600. Among the more advantaged, and these are people who are college graduates and so forth, you would have 3 to 4 times as many words, almost 2,200, almost 4 times the number of words. And it's not just the number of words, it's also the nature of the parenting environment. So what we've come to understand is when we look at inequality and we look at the importance of the family, it's not just a question of money. And even efficient policies that are directed towards helping disadvantaged children are not necessarily those that are focusing primarily on transfers of money. So we can see, for example, in the more disadvantaged families, the parenting style itself is less advantaged. Children are given a more discouraging environment. Instead of encouraged to go forward and make statements about the structure of, go out and our positive reinforcement, what we actually find is that many children are prohibited and they're discouraged from exploring new ideas. And we move to more advantaged environments. There's much more affirmation and support of the child, much more interaction. And so the literature now, when looking at this IGE and looking at the role, finds that parenting strategies differ. And what's also very interesting, and again, this is mostly data from the US, is that when we do surveys and we look at knowledge, we find that even among different social and economic groups, expectations about what proper parenting roles should be vary greatly. Among the very disadvantaged people, many don't know simple things. For example, the difficulty of drinking and smoking when a woman is pregnant and what consequences it might have for the development of the child. which could lead to lifetime consequences in terms of retardation, in terms of skill base that essentially is not very strong. And so we know that there is a real scarcity of information. So it's not just income. Even if we gave income, the information wouldn't be there. So that we have some studies now that are suggesting this is quantitatively a very important thing. And what's interesting is we have studies where we do give information, and we find that giving information about preventing drinking and smoking and so forth actually leads to substantial improvements in the life of the child. So this is what I want to talk about, and I'll just summarize what the literature is saying, and I want to give you some idea of the literature. By the way, just this cumulative process, if we look at the number of words that children know at age 3, between the advantage and the disadvantage, it's more than twice as many words. So what you're seeing is dramatic differences, and these dramatic differences build on each other. So the question is always, as you were saying, Dr. Chirber, really understanding mechanisms. The real danger in public policy is looking at just simple correlations, like this correlation that I put up a minute ago. I mean, that's a very common curve. The Obama administration is actually acting on the curve right now, saying we need to redistribute income. But I'm not sure that's a correct strategy. It may be a correct strategy in India, but it's not just an income transfer policy, and I think that's what we want to try to understand. Now, you mentioned that Amartya Sen had been here before, so I'm going to actually build on a theme that Amartya Sen develops, he and his co-authors. And that's this notion of capability. And this actually leads to a structure which dominates, at least my thinking on the literature, and I think is becoming increasingly widespread. And that is understanding what it is, at least when we think about skills, capabilities, the capacities to act, how these skills emerge, how they're developed, and what the essential ingredients are of a life cycle model of human development. So the first thing to understand, and I think this is a very important lesson, about a week ago I was actually in Sao Paulo, Brazil, before I came to India. I went to Sao Paulo first. And many people in India and around the world are very focused on one dimension of human skill. It's dominated public policy discussions. And that dimension is basically the PISA score. It's the test score, the achievement test. I don't know the discussion in India, but my suspicion is that's there. And what was quite remarkable about the discussion in Sao Paulo by the OECD, and this was an OECD conference, and there were many education ministers from all around the OECD who came, is that they had become to recognize the limitation of looking only at a PISA-based nature of the intervention. That we need to have more comprehensive notion of evaluation. And this is exactly what Sen has been talking about for years. My notion here is more focused, looking at individual capabilities, not the whole range of public policy that Amartya Sen is talking about, but it is looking at aspects of human performance. And here, we've come to understand that things like more than cognition, more than what an achievement test score measures, more than what a PISA score measures, aspects of what are sometimes called non-cognitive skills, the skills not captured by cognitive tests, playing a huge role, social preferences, personality traits. And the good news, even though many people think these are very difficult to measure and we have no way of doing so, was at the Sao Paulo conference and in a publication, I have a new book out looking at exactly these issues, that we can measure these. And more than just measuring them, they turn out to be as predictive or more predictive than a lot of the achievement tests in explaining life outcomes over the life cycle. So we need to think when we evaluate public policies and think about how public policies are developing human capacity, a full vector of capabilities. And these capabilities are affecting, of course, earnings. So more able people, more industrious people earn more. People have higher ability, can command generally better market resources. But also some of these same abilities translate into the ability of people to process information. And we can also think about what the capabilities are of parents. So we think about this in an intergenerational sense. So what we've come to understand that these capabilities are multiple in nature. They're stable across situations, but they evolve over time. Now, why do I say that? I think at some level that's completely obvious. But at another level, we think about recent work in behavioral economics. Many people have said that some of these other traits, besides cognition, are not stable. The personality traits that have to do with the structure of how we interact in society and how we control ourselves. Social preferences and personality traits vary so much from situation to situation that we can't measure them. They're not a stable feature. And what we've come to learn is that these traits are stable, they vary, they can evolve. We have policies that actually can shape these capabilities. But it's true that how I act, what my personality is, exactly how I achieve, that's going to vary from situation to situation as the incentives vary. Which means that when we measure these personality traits, we need to capture the incentives. But they are stable once we control for the incentive. And they're an important part of our what a comprehensive evaluation system would be. So I want to think about a set of relationships, MT, just a very abstract map, that's mapping these capabilities, which I denote by theta, this vector of capabilities, into a set of outcomes. And the important development in this literature is that a core, low-dimensional set of capabilities generates a variety of diverse outcomes. So what we're actually doing, and I think doing it in a way, is we're operationalizing the notion of capability more than has been done so far in the capabilities approach. But we've also embedded it in a dynamic life cycle setting. And so what we think about these capabilities is that they give people the capacity to act. It gives people the freedom of choice, the ability to somehow to control their lives. And so in some sense, a measure of freedom is the dimension of the number of capabilities. How many actions can I take? And then, of course, the economic policy would be, how many of those actions can I shape and make available to children through a variety of different investment strategies? So in some sense, if you want to think about it, what we're doing is we're quantifying and measuring these capabilities in a way that hasn't been done before, but it supplements and builds on work prior to its own work, the work by Marchesson and others in his organization. So the notion is that many outcomes, and the key notion is a low-dimensional set of these capabilities. So if we have for every outcome a capability, it's not a very operational scientific theory. What we come to understand is, yes, it's not just one or two capabilities, there are multiple capabilities, but there are a low-dimensional set which can explain a variety of outcomes: crime, earnings, the capacity to achieve education, health. All of these are generated by the low-dimensional set. And this gives us an integrated capacity to think across a number of different literatures. So instead of thinking about just solving a problem in health, or solving a problem reducing crime, or solving a problem in promoting education, we think more generally about what capabilities matter, and how those capabilities, those same capabilities, map into a variety of life outcomes. And then the idea of freedom is the maximum capability sets for an individual, and trying to give choices, not to prescribe a particular choice, but to give people freedom to choose the option, try a number of different lifestyles as they achieve. So the measurement is very important. But a second component is the technology capability formation. And here is a case where economics integrates strongly with neuroscience, with developmental psychology, and a lot of work in biology. So if you look at that capability vector, and it's a vector, what we see is that capabilities are self-productive. In some sense, you could think of it like depreciation, simply saying there isn't 100% depreciation, but it's deeper than that. There are synergisms, complementarities across these different capabilities. So the motto here is that these capabilities help generate future capabilities. A person with a stronger capability base, actually, there's a dynamism that actually is intrinsic even in capabilities. On top of that, we have investments, the IT. Investments can be schools, it can be parents, it can be neighborhoods, a whole variety of things, health interventions, and so forth. And then, of course, the parenting and the village and the environment in which the child is raised. So we think about this in a very general, dynamic way. And the key notion then is the measurement equation, and then the technology and capability formation, which is how the dynamics emerge over the life cycle. And we're starting to understand these dynamics. And what's very interesting is that we have not only econometric estimates of these, but we also have estimates from animal studies, And we have estimates from even with rhesus monkeys. I'll talk maybe briefly about that. But we also have a number of interventions where we can actually intervene and change experimentally the investments, and we see how those map in. But if you put together these two outcome equations with the technology equation, you get some very interesting economics and some very interesting way to approach social policy. So let me just talk about what those are. Now, the first and most important idea in this literature is the idea of complementarity. Complementarity, of course, is a very old idea in economics. So what it's really saying in this case here is, you can think of it as the cross partial between the theta and the I is positive. So investments are generally higher, the higher the level of capabilities. Okay? And that by itself is a very powerful argument for disequalizing investments. If somebody starts with advantage, what you can get is that investments, IT, are generally more predictive. So for example, in the United States, when we've looked at the rate of return to college, we found relatively low returns now for 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds for low ability individuals. People with low levels of cognitive and non-cognitive skills, quite low. Even negative returns, we've estimated in some recent literature, paper we published recently in the American Economic Review. But we also found rates of return that were extremely high for very able people. So this notion is, yes, complementarity there's definitely a complementarity. But there's also something which is not appreciated in the literature, which is actually a force for policies that promote equality. And that is that this complementarity actually increases with age. As an organism, and I literally mean an organism, not just a human being, but of course we're more interested in human beings. Generally speaking, and this is true across animal species, but certainly true among human beings, that this complementarity increases with age. Now that sounds like a good thing, but what it also means is that the higher the ability of an individual and the later the age, the more efficient investment is for that individual. So there is this complementarity that increases with age. This is a force for disequalization. And what we found is that complementarity is positive, but it's also the case that at very early ages, we sometimes find that it's negative, which means then that there's actually a good capacity for substitution, that you can compensate. So the disequalizing nature of complementarity at older ages is not found, at least to the same degree, at younger ages. But even if it is positive, it's much weaker at younger ages. So that's an interesting idea. So this creates an idea that is new and actually has some very interesting implications for social policy, for economic policy. But it's something also that's empirically founded, something we've studied using dynamic data, panel data on individuals' life cycles, but it's also found in versions of animal models. So if you take this notion of complementarity, which is a disequalizing notion, we should invest in the most capable people, with dynamic complementarity, we get an idea that actually is a force for investing in the more disadvantaged. And the argument is, you're building the skill base. So the dynamic complementarity says, okay, I invest today, I'm increasing the capital stock, theta, really just a capital stock problem, next period, and because of self-productivity, I'm increasing the capital stock down the road, which means then that investments today, early in the life cycle of the child, can be very productive, precisely because they make it productive later. Now, this sounds trivial, and at some level, mathematically, it is trivial. But what's interesting is the standard model. I mentioned Becker and Combs and Solon, and most of the models are one-period models of the life cycle. The idea is that an investment at age 18 is the same productivity as investment at age 1. And if that's true, in other words, that investments are like perfect substitutes over the life cycle within childhood, that on the basic economics of it, if the cost of investment is the same at all periods, you would always invest more in the later period, right? You put the money in the bank, you get your return. If you're only interested in adult outcomes, you put your money in and you invest later. But this notion of dynamic complementarity changes all that. And it also suggests that there may be social policies that transfer investments early on that can be highly productive and that they trade off this dynamic complementarity. And I can't go through the whole literature. I don't have enough time, and it's in the handout, but there is a lot of evidence on this point. So just from an empirical standpoint, the measurement equation and the technology summarize a lot of other arguments. And there's a huge amount of empirical work. It's available. They were frightened because I have a 200-page handout. I'm not going through 200 pages in the handout, so don't worry. But it's in the handout, and that can be made available if anybody wants to see it. There are a lot of. So there is evidence that this is true. So what this is very interesting evidence. So it actually summarizes a lot of evidence that we've seen in evaluating job training programs in the United States. So for example, if you look at programs that are designed to promote cognitive skills for less advantaged adolescents, typically the rates of return, the benefit-cost ratios, have shown very low rates of return. People who are not very high level of ability, generally the returns on investment are low in the adolescent years. But it's also true that when we look at investments in the early years, they've had very high rates of return. So how can that be? It can be precisely because of this dynamics of skill formation. And there's a subtle nuance too. If I go back to this production function, data is a vector, remember, and investments are vectors. And so what we also find is that productivity differs depending on the nature of the capability. That cognitive skills are set at a relatively early age. So you get rank stability of things like IQ by the time roughly at age 10. Very difficult to change IQ beyond a certain age. But if you look at other dimensions like these soft skills, so-called non-cognitive skills, personality skills, they're much more malleable over the lifetime. So another idea is this critical and sensitive period, that the derivative of investment for even any given level of these same arguments, that investment is more productive in the early years for cognition. In the later years, if you're going to make an investment, the productivity is highest if you were to do things in non-cognitive skills. So it even suggests the nature of the intervention is different and the nature of the evaluation of the intervention is different. Let me just give you an example that we found in the US. When we looked at something called Job Corps is an adolescent remediation program. It's something that's designed to take school dropouts, secondary school dropouts, give them job training, put them in a facility that gives them skills, and then puts them back out on the market after a period of 6 months to a year, sometimes as long as 2 years. This has been evaluated by the US government with an experimental evaluation. People are randomly assigned to job training, Job Corps, random. When you did that evaluation, even though they had intensive education, they had a cognitive formation and so forth, mostly cognitively oriented investments, it turned out when you followed, the return was negative. There was a negative rate of return. You paid money, but the kids were no better off having finished the program than having gone into it. That's very discouraging. Now, if you look at disadvantaged young children and ask what's the rate of return there, the estimates are much more optimistic. You're finding rates of return of 7 to 10% a year. 7 to 10% per annum, very high rate of return, at least compared to investment in U.S. equity. And so this technology captures that idea, and it also captures the idea that we need to think about the full life cycle. We need to think about the full life cycle and how that life cycle translates and where efficient policy investment can be. So that's the main theme in terms of those two aspects. But when we think about more general models, we want to also think, and this is an unexplored avenue, even though we're starting to explore it, what is the role of family preferences? What's the role of family information and the role of family preferences? We're just beginning to understand that. We know that across different economic and social groups, different groups have different aspirations for their children. And this actually translates directly into the level of investment. And even notions about beliefs about proper child rearing. Among some groups in the United States, there's even a belief that a proper parenting style involves no interaction with the child, leaving the child alone, or maybe stifling the child's curiosity. And we know for other reasons and other studies when we supplemented children's lives, that's not a particularly good outcome. So we've talked about these restrictions. Family resources play a huge role. But the question is, how important are income constraints in the U.S. as opposed to some of these other constraints? So I'll just summarize very briefly. But these are the kinds of issues that are out there, and I can just sort of hint at what the discussion would be. There are other constraints, information, genes, I already talked about. But this diagram summarizes the challenge, the theoretical and empirical challenge of really understanding what appropriate policies would be. So if we think about how we build capabilities, at least those capabilities that are associated with skills in the individual, this vector of capabilities, we can think, and we do think, and there's a lot of literature suggesting that prenatal interventions play a very powerful role, and that these skills feed into each other. So the parental environments, the theta P, pre-birth plays a huge role, and that these investments then are feeding on each other, and that there's a huge role where there's self-productivity, and the investments have different levels of productivity for different levels and different types of skills. So the empirical challenge, which is now being met in the United States, and now starting to be adopted by world organizations, like the OECD in particular, is to try to fill in this diagram, to understand at what stages in the life cycle, for what skills, are these investments productive? What do we know about them? So I think maybe, I only have a few more minutes, right? 10 minutes. So I think what I'll do is skip through this. I have a series of models, but I think I'll just skip these models because I really don't have enough time. But let me sketch one model that actually, I will sketch this. So there's a bare bones model. I know that Lakshmi Rao was here last December, and he talked about a version of this model in the paper that he gave me. We have this paper under revision of the Journal of Econometrics. But let me just sketch a model which gives you some basic idea. This is a bare bones model. It actually strips a lot of what I'm saying out of the essence of it, but it also gets to the core of some of the economic ideas. And so the first idea, in much of the literature has taken this idea, is a pure investment model. That we think about parenting as a kind of investment in the child. And so in the extreme, the idea is we have a passive child who makes no economic decisions, and even whose consumption is ignored, but who receives investment. So you send the kid to school, parents don't care at all if the kid's happy or not in school, but they're interested in his long-term welfare. That's the kind of idea. It's an overlapping generations model, multi-period, like Rout was giving. So that's the details. Let me go through a standard type of CES technology. Of course, it's familiar here, worked by many people here in India. But if you look, for example, now it's one skill, one capability, I'm throwing away a lot. We could imagine a technology in which we use CES, and we have then a parameter phi, which is giving you a degree of substitution, how well theta and t substitutes for IT. And we know then that we can get different parameters playing very different roles. Rho is a measure of diminishing return. So this is kind of standard CES restrictions. If we substitute out, and we just take a special case, 2 periods of childhood, 2 periods of adulthood, overlapping generations model, and we then assume that the degree of substitution between investments and capabilities is the same at different periods, we're led to this equation H prime, which is the human capital of the adult. And it consists then of 2 stages of investment. Investment in the first period and investment in the second period. Investment in the first period plays a role not only because it affects the theta stock, but it also affects the ability, the complementarity, the productivity of investment in the second period. And so there's a multiplier effect, and that's an important idea. So that's what a final form representation would be. Now, the standard model in this literature takes phi equal to 1. Investments at different stages in the literature are perfect substitutes. That's a very strong assumption. Let me take an opposite case, because we're in the CES world, it's easy to think of this case. And that's the Leontief technology, the left shoe, right shoe technology, where you need 1. And this example arises in a case where phi goes to minus infinity. This is a polar case. That gives you equation 3. What this is saying is actually very important. It is kind of the polar case. It's to the essence of what's going on with this dynamic complementarity. Suppose, in fact, we had this extreme case, that we have Leontief technology. Then what would be the case? That if I have an I1 of 0 in the first period, in other words, a child who receives no investment, what's the productivity of investment in the second period? The optimal level would also be 0. But literally, if I have no base to build on, it makes no productivity. So what it's saying is that early period investments are extremely important, because without them, the later period investments play no role. That's just in polar opposition to this case where phi is equal to 1, we have perfect substitute, which I think has been the model which has dominated much of the literature in human investment strategy. So it also has a second implication, though, that unless the investment in the first period is followed up, there'll be no benefit for investing in the first period. So this is suggesting that the timing of investment plays an important role. So I can go through, but I don't think I will. Maybe I should just wrap up. I could talk about a lot more if you want a few more hours, which I don't think you do. And have some questions and have some discussion. But I'll stop with this and just summarize a very large body of empirical work. First of all, so we can write down models where U is parental utility function. The standard model in this literature has been, until recently, one of altruism. That children, parents are valuing the children's utility, not a particular choice of the child, not a particular outcome of the child. Then we have standard discount factors, real interest rate, and then this parental altruism factor, this new factor. And so you can write this whole problem down in this form here. Now, more recently, we've come up with a model which is suggesting paternalism is far more important. At least with the US data, we're finding, in fact, parents are not acting altruistically, partly because they're ignorant, so there's an ignorance factor. So maybe they're acting altruistically, but out of ignorance. But there's also a case where parents, of course, value particular outcomes of children. So one of the most interesting findings in the recent literature, this is affecting credit constraints that are important, has been that the nature of the transfer of resources from the parent to the child is not what you would get out of a pure altruism model, which would be like lump sum transfer, giving kids cash, investing in a general way. But it's actually giving kids tied payments, targeted payments. So it's like a quid pro quo. I will give you money, but you have to go to college. So the nature of the transfer varies. And it varies across education levels. More educated parents are actually more likely to use this mechanism. So when we think about the family, we have to think of much richer models. We also, and another dimension by which recent work has actually shown a great deal of progress and work that I'm actively engaged in, is the nature of the investment decision. So far, this is a very passive child that's going on in the model. You'll see that C1 and C2 in equation 4 are utilities of the parents. We're not even worried about the parent utility of the children in these specifications. What you are interested in is their value function as an adult, but not their utility. But this model of technology formation is a very limited model capturing the nature of human interaction. And so what's happened increasingly is building a model in which we see two things happen. The child's playing a much more active role. So there's an emergence of the child as a decision-making agent, much more general than this model here. And the nature of a game, of an interaction. So you get the notion of maturity. As the child becomes more mature, the child is able to capture and make investments more wisely. And so we can count on that. It's also the case that if parents don't have altruistic considerations, children may compete, because children's goals may be very different from parents' goals. Hence, we can explain why the nature of the interaction is not just cash transfers. It's actually cash transfers targeted to satisfy parental paternalistic. But it's also something else that's not even captured by this model, and that is the nature of information. Even if you have a child in your family, you only have imperfect information about what the child's effort is and the motivation. And so what we've done is actually built a model in which we have a game being played by the parent and the child. And the parent and the child has some information, the parent has some information, but it's not full information. And it can lead to some very, very interesting dynamics in which the parents may inappropriately judge, so that if the child isn't doing well, the parent may say, oh, look, you're not doing well at school because you're not trying. But how do they know? It could be there are other limitations. It could be some limitations of the school. That itself leads the child itself to respond to this parent strategy. And so you get some very interesting interaction. So there's a whole body of work, and I don't have time to summarize it all, but it's a very rich body of work that goes beyond this model. So this model is just the very beginning, but it captures some of the key ideas. Now, just to sort of summarize, we have a large body of experimental and non-experimental evidence that actually can be explained by more elaborate versions of this model. So for example, we found when we look at interventions in early childhood, and we've gotten associated with a number of these interventions now, that because of this technology, and because if we go back to equation 1 versus equation 2, when we increase the capability of a child, when we increase cognitive and non-cognitive skills, it affects outcomes across a wide variety of interventions. So just 2 days ago, or I guess last Friday or Thursday, in this magazine Science, published in the US, I have a co-authored paper where we showed that an early childhood intervention that was initially targeted to boosting the IQ of children, targeted to children 0 to 5, had substantial effects on lifetime health of the children. So that at age 35, you find that those children were much less at risk for diabetes, had much better cardiovascular health, even though that had nothing to do with the nature of the intervention. The intervention was one towards cognitive, non-cognitive skills, parenting, things that many people don't think go together, but this technology of skill formation equation and capability formation tells you do go together, hence this vector of skill. So that's one thing that's quite interesting. So you can actually then find consequences that were unanticipated consequences. But it also suggests something else. And we think about even health policy. We think about what an effective health policy would be. Most people think about health policy in a very narrow way. People are sick, we should have hospitals, and we cure them. We take people who are sick. But this policy is saying, well, let them be fine. We certainly don't want to say you should have bad hospitals or bad doctors. But it also suggests that if we build the skill base of the children, we actually prevent the problem from occurring in the first place. And as a result, we can get very high returns. So a policy of prevention can be quite dramatic. But a prevention policy is more than just nutrition. It's a policy that also is teaching cognitive and non-cognitive skills. I have another paper that was actually Friday accepted in Science, so it's a different paper, where we look at exactly a nutritional intervention for stunted children in Jamaica. And these children basically were very low weight per height, they were stunted, they had very low growth statistics. And the people creating this intervention in the slums of Kingston, Jamaica, initially thought we should give nutrition. But some people wisely said, suppose we give the children nutrition, but we also give them cognitive and non-cognitive stimulation. There were 3 arms to the treatment as well as a control group. So there were four arms altogether. Now we give these different treatment arms to children, and we follow them over their life cycle, in this case to their mid-20s. Now we ask, where was the most successful intervention? So the successful intervention that was most effective was something that combined nutrition, which there were nutritional issues, but combining that with non-cognitive social and emotional skills, things that had to do with parenting, teaching the relationship between parenting and improving the parent-child interaction. And that, I think, has important policy lessons. That an effective health strategy, which is not thought of much in the United States, I doubt that it's thought of much in India, is to actually think about building those capabilities. Now, what's going on there? By giving these people, empowering them with more education, and by giving them self-control, and by giving them these capacities to flourish, if you will, to have more freedom, and I would call this a definition of freedom, gives people maximum flexibility in life, including the knowledge of health, including the knowledge of self-control. We found that 30 years after the intervention, and in both in the ABC and in the 20 to 30 years in the Jamaican project, we find substantial improvements in health and in crime and a number of other dimensions which many people put together separately. Remember, there's a policy bias, and I suspect it's true here in India, it's certainly true in the United States. And that is, if you think, how do you prevent crime? You hire more police. How do you prevent health problems? You get better doctors and better hospitals. How do you promote this, that, and the other thing? You go through a list of those. But when we understand the full meaning of the capability approach, we understand improving this vector of capabilities supplements those approaches, and in some cases can be very effective. So let me just conclude by saying there's a large body of evidence on this. The most interesting thing has to do with the nature of the investment strategy, which I think involves much more than the notion of a passive child getting investment, the notion of actually changing the opportunities and changing the nature of the parent-child interaction in a way that actually leads to sustained lifetime bliss. So it's just a much broader notion about policy evaluation. But it also suggests, as a concluding role, of one way to put together a large body of data on family studies. What does the family do? The family has its own technology of skill fund. The family is producing these thetas. It has its investment. The family is also supplemented sometimes by government programs, by interventions by NGOs and other agencies. We can see how these things interact in producing these capabilities. And then we can try to gauge more efficient growth. So that's a sketch of a strategy, and I appreciate your attention, and I'd love to have some questions.
Thank you, Professor Heckman. Now I am even more convinced that we need Professor Heckman here in India. But I'll throw it open, but just let me link up a couple of things we are doing in India to perhaps what you said. One is, of course, the data that you have. I mean, we don't have the Gini on income. We are using consumption data here, but I think the figures you showed are not that far off anyway. So, but the income consumption Gini would be probably higher, probably in the range of 0.45 or something like that. Now, the other interesting thing is for us, you know, if you break that, if you do the UNDP calculates inequality adjusted human development index, and there what you find for India is that the inequality in health and education is even bigger than the inequality. That's what you would expect as well. I do want to point out that for a long while, India, of course, didn't pay much attention to early childhood education. But we do now have a program called the ICPS program, which actually tries to, it doesn't go from age 0 to 5, I think it goes from age 2 to 5, 2 to 6, right? But which does have this aspect of nutrition, but also you know, some early childhood education. It's not run very well, and you know.
We heard about that in Chicago
Right.
weekend.
Right.
There's some commentary about the ICPS program not being
Right.
that effective.
But there is a program. At least there's somebody thinking. You know, in the way you mentioned about the Jamaica study, that's quite important. I think the other thing, interesting thing, is that we've had surveys now on learning outcomes. And of course, India has walked out of the PISA test because we have walked out. We stopped doing PISA tests. I think the results were too bad. We were like 170. We were 72 out of 73.
Wow.
But we have another survey that's going on here called the USSA survey, which is looking at learning outcomes. So what that is finding is that enrollment is increasing not in school, but learning outcomes going down. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention a few of these to you as well. But with that, but I think what you said also about training programs is very appropriate here. I mean, we have a plethora of public training programs, and I don't know if any proper evaluation has ever been done on their outcomes, but listening to your talk, I can already guess what the evaluation findings, wherever done, would show the results would be. Let me throw it open to comments, questions. Yes?
This slide says
investment increases, beta increases. Beta. Oh, beta increases with level. With the investment goes up. Well, so inequality in investment knowledge becomes possible. In other words, there's more inequality, public good, beta will go up. So in preserving inequality, rich get public good, poor don't. That's going to be. That's understood. But then, if you then go to the earlier thing that, depending on the background, the family is welfare family or a professional family, there are large differences when at age 3. Yes. How do you make that inequality? How do you moderate? What kind of investment can you think? Okay, that's something I've been working on very actively and is subject for much discussion. Again, I don't know much about the ICDS program. I just heard about it. Well, I think I heard a little bit about it in this exchange between Bagwadi and Sen and Dres, but not so much. And it was more discussed this last weekend. And I can't hold myself out as an authority on India. Quite easily, actually. But what we found in the U.S. is that programs that tend to enrich the early environment of children, by that I mean giving these kids some kind of cognitive and non-cognitive stimulation. Parenting styles differ greatly. And as I say, it isn't all money, at least in the U.S. Now, I'm hesitant to say that. When I look at some of the extreme levels of poverty in India, surely money makes a difference. I know that in China, where I have been doing some work, that out in rural China, the school fees are excessive. So you'll find that in many cases, the annual tuition fee for a rural Chinese child will be half of the annual income of the child, parents, which makes it prohibitive. In rural China, you can have multiple children, so a one-child policy doesn't make sense. So I think income can play a huge role. So I'm not saying it's not income. In the U.S., I think it's over-exaggerated, overstated in the U.S. But the policies then consist of a variety. So maybe income, but on top of that, changing the nature of the parent-child interaction, including giving some hope. That's not working. Including giving some information to the parents. See, for example, we have this program in the United States called the Nurse-Family Partnership Program. And the Nurse-Family Partnership Program is basically giving pregnant girls who are teenagers, and many of these are mothers who basically are dropouts from secondary school. They're very poor and in many ways very ignorant. You tell them information, don't drink alcohol, don't use drugs while you're carrying your child. That actually changes their behavior in a very beneficial way. And we know from a whole biological literature that early insults like, fetal alcohol syndrome is a serious problem among disadvantaged groups, certain disadvantaged groups. Drug use and smoking can have serious consequences. On top of that, nutrition plays a huge role. We know that in some parts of the world, certainly India is one of them, rural India, there are serious micronutrient deficiencies. And so getting in there and actually giving people iron, zinc, and eliminating lead and various kinds of toxins that are in those environments can have huge benefits. So the most extreme example I can think of is the benefit-cost ratio for vitamin A deficiency. Serious vitamin A deficiency, which is prevalent in India, can lead to blindness. So one drop of vitamin A early in the life cycle, it has to be early, can actually lead to averting any blindness. Now, I don't know if anybody's put a value on sightedness versus blindness, but it's got to be huge. The one drop of vitamin A can't cost that much, and it has huge lifetime consequences. So it's this vector of intervention, but it's associated with what kind of advantage of a middle-class child, say, growing up in Delhi or many other, middle-class family in India, one that's actually getting some nutrients, proper nutrition, proper stimulation. So it's this bundle that actually constitute that kind of. I don't know if that answers your question. But some of these programs, many of these programs have been experimentally evaluated. So it's not just a thought. It's a case where we can look at. We've seen, for example, in some less developed countries, in Chile, 40 years ago, there were studies done where children had serious exposure, iron deficiency. And those who were untreated with iron actually led up with permanently lower IQ, 10 to 15 points lower. Led to a form of retardation. Children given just iron supplements we're actually finding much higher gains in IQ. Again, they're just the capacity to function of life was improved. So again, I just see this as kind of enhancing the capabilities of the child, but through parenting, through nutrition, and so forth. But relatively early. Yes, I mean, that's a version of this supplementation. Yes. Right now we have these biographies of people who grew up on Sesame Street. People, for example, dual language people, Hispanic Americans who grew up, their own families were not speaking English, but they were able to learn from television parts. So there have been some evaluations, although not, I would say the more effective ones probably haven't been Sesame Street per se. But that kind of intervention where you're supplementing the life of the child, just offering the parents supplement.
Right.
Heckman, thanks. That's a wonderful talk. Back to who I want to ask.
Yes, that's good. Yes. Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah, not that far. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a question. Yeah.
Yeah. What the question I had is, you talked about the great Gatsby curve.
Yes.
And this great Gatsby trap
Right.
or in curve. And to help disadvantaged kids get out of that trap, the relative weight of these three things, self-productivity, cost-effective investment, very important.
Yes.
So, question I had is, in the empirical data that you have across the world and so on, if you disentangle it,
Yes.
decompose it, what's the value of data relative to ICD?
So this, maybe I probably will keep looking. Just look at this equation. So what we find is, as you get older, remember everything has a T subset. T means age. So the older the person, the higher the T. That's the sense of T. What we find is that, first of all, and it's also not just the own derivative, but the process. Right? What we find is self-productivity becomes stronger and stronger. I didn't really emphasize. Basically, the fact that it's very difficult to change, early conditions, as they build up, they accumulate life. These things become more and more literal. Generally speaking, the older we get, the less investment productivity occurs. This is not just true in childhood. You can see, for example, when they adopted a new computer technology, comes along. You look at people who are mid-50s versus their 15 or early teens, you'll find much greater productivity, much lower costs on per kid. And so much higher productivity in key as well. It also partly depends on the nature of the investment and also the nature of the capability. This is a vector value function. So these are different capabilities, cognitive, non-cognitive, health. And actually, the non-cognitive conditions have a many components that are recently reaction. So I don't want to oversimplify. So what we find though is that this IT is very important in the early teens, especially cognitive skills. Self-productivity becomes very strong in cognitive skills. So after age 10 or so, it becomes very difficult to change what's sometimes called fluid intelligence. You know, the capacity to do abstract reasoning. You can still build knowledge, so you can still accumulate knowledge, which is acquired facts, information, and for non-cognitive skills, like social and emotional regulation, and sometimes psychologists call executive functioning, this whole category of self-control and promotion, you find that there's a lot of malleability and productivity, even into the 20s for investment. So those investments have, but notice what I'm saying, that for different technology, for different capabilities, there's a different notion. But the general drift is that the earlier the age, the higher the productivity of a lot of people. And then when you get to very older age, it's not that you can't learn. Neurogenesis goes down the whole life. You can't learn. It's harder to learn. But the subtle thing, and this is what I haven't said, the subtle thing is that this becomes it's effective, and it actually depends on which capability and which age. And what's happening then is that generally speaking, productivity is going down in teenage. But there's a lot more malleability in non-cognitive skills than cognitive. And that's directly associated with work in neuroscience about slowly developing the prefrontal cortex. Even laws recognize young adolescents, even young adults, are not fully accountable. It's partly the brain is emerging, and the brain is, that's the parenting thing, and that's part of what mentoring does even for an adolescent. So that what we see, and this is why I don't want to see too negative about job training, properly constructed. Some job training programs are very effective. Which ones? Those are ones having to do with mentoring. Those have to do with kind of teaching self-regulation, non-cognitive skills. And so we have a paper, I'm happy to talk about it. It's not this paper, another paper. Yeah. There's actually the paper presented in Sao Paulo last week, which reviews a large number of interventions on both the U.S. and European data at different stages of the life cycle, looking at which ones are effective now. And there are some adolescent programs. But what it does, these are ones that actually are doing mentoring, that are actually giving children, they interacting with children, providing advice, and workplace-based. So instead of job training out of a public facility, totally removed from market reality, integrating work. And so integrating work with education, and then providing mentoring along with it. So there are some things that it's not like it's public. But that's the subtlety of it. Yes, these are doing. So I don't want to see the danger in some of this literature is to say these critical and sensitive periods, it's all over by age 3, all over by age 2. That's just wrong. But it also and also another danger is to say it's all about IQ. So I was hoping you would say that you got out of PISA, you thought it was an inadequate measure. Now you're saying you thought it was too good and you didn't do very well on it and you want to get rid of it.
Well,
but I would say it's an adequate measure, and you shouldn't judge yourself solely by the PISA scores.
right.
So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question. Oh, but wait, one other component for arithmetic. So there we can find and see what that's very interesting. We broadly define parenting. Many people think of parenting only with a young child and a parent. But if you think about what I was saying with mentoring, mentoring is a kind of parenting. It's parenting adapted to the age of the child. It's advising the child and staying with the child. And what we found is that if you broaden this notion about parental capability, those also play very important roles. We find that it's very difficult to follow them, mentor them, give them some guidance in school, and even close to grow. That can actually have very beneficial. But there still is relative productivity. There's a paper we have in Econometrics, which actually doesn't the whole identifies this thing, to give you some idea of the quantitative importance. Then we have a series of other papers, later papers, in the century, I referenced this. And there's a whole body of other work, the other stuff as well, looking at how it's important. But it's a very good question. It's something we're really starting to understand. So that's why it's not just equation 2, because the graphical version of equation 2 is this thing here. Whoops. That's really just saying, putting it as a direct graph. That's basically what we're doing with the first investment here. And we really want to understand which of these places, or which of these capabilities is most effective. That's an ongoing process. So I don't want to say it's all settled, it's all known. And by the way, I mentioned other species. There's work. I wrote a paper with a person, Eric Knudsen, who actually works with birds. And he's actually learning from language acquisition of birds. And it's quite interesting to look at birds. So if you take a bird, you raise the bird in an environment with totally different birds, different species, that bird tries to imitate as best it can the language pattern of the adopted species. And so you actually see there that those early childhood experiences, and then it becomes very difficult to change the bird song after a few years. So there were experiments done with animals suggesting that And for example, the learning of a second language, we know that too, like in terms of critical and sensitive theory. After about 10 or 11, the neuroscientists tell us that we learn a second language differently. We actually, different parts of the brain actually do that. And it's much harder to learn a second language without accent. But if you do it at a very early age, it is. Now, I know in the U.S., we typically teach the second language in the high school year, which is past kind of critical theory. And so, again, I don't want to say it's all sudden, but there's a lot of literature suggesting that there are these critical sensitive periods, not just with us, but with other people as well. That's what I think can help these people. But also, I don't want to suggest it's all over at any particular age. So I think anybody, even the oldest person, can still learn. So,
there's hope for all of us.
yes. Yes. Well, there's a study I mentioned in Jamaica. And, that's interesting. Actually, I had a long discussion with an unfortunately deceased colleague, a man who taught me a great deal. His name was Fraser Mustard. He lives in Canada and is actually responsible for a lot of this work. But Mustard was very interested in Cuba, because Cuba has been a society that's been highly equal. And in the sense that if you look at some of the measures, you mentioned human development measures, for example, that in many measures of child performance, where they've actually provided health and education and so forth, the Cuban children are doing quite well, for example, in terms of, so there was an extreme, part of it is actually ideological. We actually know that totalitarian regimes, or at least regimes, whether it's South Africa under apartheid, or Cuba, or Vietnam, or China after the 1949 revolution, have tended to emphasize education. So you actually see substantial improvement in the educational base of the child. Many people have said, for example, in the Chinese case, that that educational base wasn't enough by itself. But once the reforms got in place, you had a much more educated primary workforce. China is running up against the wall now, higher levels of education, but it certainly was an educated workforce. Same thing was true, by the way, of Ireland. In the 1960s, Irish tuition fees were enormous. They dropped the tuition fees from a much more educated population. So that's not socialist, but it did suggest the education. And then they tried some pro-growth policy. They had the skill base to take advantage of the population. So it's not just the redistribution. I know that's a controversial issue in India, but it also has to have some incentive to kind of use the resources that are required. Cuba is a great example. And again, for many dimensions, Cuba, not that it's a great economic performance, it's a disaster. The society has not done that well in terms of economic growth. And my guess is that whenever the regime finally changes, opens up to a market base, Cubans are going to do extremely well. There's big growth that will occur. So I think, but the preconditions have been raised. So the socialist economists have emphasized a lot more equality, provision of health, and the provision of education. So in that sense, I think, and the measures of child development have actually been very satisfactory. I was at a conference with a group of Cuban scholars, and unless they were lying through their teeth, which I don't believe they were, they showed that a lot of these measures of capability of children were actually quite beneficial as a result of government policy. So there is a role for policy.
Take one at the back there.
Thank you. Professor, I am so overawed. If I fumble, please pardon me. But what I made out was that we are not bothered just about the state delivering welfare so that everyone has good education, good health, etc. Also, we are worried about the equity. And the classical liberals may be wrong in raising a scarecrow about very big state. I was just wondering whether inherited wealth can be seen from this angle. That not only is it unfair to not have a very heavy inheritance tax, but also it may be promoting inefficiency, at least for the child that knows that I am getting so much wealth. From that angle also, promote efficiency, not just justice. It may be a good idea, and are there any studies on this? I was wondering, in America or elsewhere, whether having a curtailment of inherited wealth helps efficiency as well.
Well,
And
yes.
just one more thing on India, I wanted to share that we have a huge black economy. To count inequality, whether it is going down or up, that has to be taken into account, but we don't have data on that at all. So that adds to the quality of data in India.
All right. Now, the underground economy is a huge issue, but let me get to this issue. There's a new book on it by Prof. called Capital. Deliberately intended to mirror Marx's book, and he makes the point in that book that inherited wealth is a very important component. He looks at French data, but country data from all around the world, in particular Western Europe and the United States. And inherited wealth plays a very big role, no question about it. But I would argue, again, re-emphasizing a point I made earlier, that I think this human capital component, this skills component, is extremely important as well. It's certainly true that if you look at the entrepreneurs, so if you look at the nature of inequality in Western societies now, you find that the top 1%, or the top 1/10 of 1%, those incomes are taking off in a dramatic way. This notion of the 99 versus the 1 is a real phenomenon. And it's particularly strong in the United States, it's particularly strong in the UK, less strong in France, but it's still there in many countries, diminished. But who are the entrepreneurs? And who are the people, or who are the people, I'm giving away my language. The nature of inherited wealth has changed over the last 100 years. It used to be that the very rich at the top of the distribution were the people who basically inherited. This was the rentier class, people who were clipping coupons, the ones who were literally the children of the plutocrats from another age. But if you look now at the composition of who is wealthy, they're getting very large wealth. People, hedge fund managers, running the CEOs of large investment banks and so forth, they're getting very large salaries, huge salaries. But most of those are highly educated people, and they have been. So the notion is the nature even of who the wealthy are has changed to having a much larger human capital component. And surprisingly, there's a lot of mobility. A lot of those people are first-generation wealthy. So Bill Gates' father wasn't living in poverty, but he also wasn't an extremely affluent person. He was well-to-do, but not, relatively well-to-do. So a lot of these entrepreneurs have been people who've had moderately good, maybe good, medium income families, not the most destitute. I don't know many examples of successful hedge fund managers who grew up in destitution and became manager of a hedge fund. But they had acquired human capital and then took advantage of it. So I think it's still the case that the bulk of the transmission, a big chunk of it, is coming by providing those skills that let them take advantage now. Because their money was made by operating in markets, not just by inheriting the wealth of their father and so forth. Now, there are plenty of people still in the U.S. and around the world. Even Carlos Slim, who's one of the richest men in the world. That's true. You may question about why he's rich. He's living off a monopoly in Mexico. But I don't think he's a particularly wealthy family. My understanding is he's a good example of success. And so, but what he had was a good education and sort of good capabilities, and he took advantage of it. So I think the nature of the transmission of inequality has changed, that you at least need to give kids the preconditions. I think that's become more important now than it might have been 100 years ago. So that's why I disagree with Piketty. He thinks inherited wealth is the major issue. I think the big form of inheritance is the important role of a family in the sense of creating values, education, giving children motivation and kind of encouraging them. I think personally that's more numerically important. But Piketty would disagree. So go off and read Piketty's book. It's available both in French and in English now. So it's on Amazon.
We're into our dinner time, but this is so rich for thought. So we'll take one or two more questions. Let's maybe take the two questions together and then you.
Okay.
Sir, very general question. No, you are prescribing that public policy should be micro level individualistic target be there. And in that case, it is quite easy for the public policy for a country which is a bit more homogeneous, not that much heterogeneous like our India, where we have seen it's a regional, economical, then even the social status also are quite different. And from that angle, the creating equal opportunity as well as targeting by micro level policy intervention, that would be difficult. It's not easy. You think that, even some observable characters for two individuals from two different parts of the same country can have some different outcome into their this capability. So do you think that in India, the public policy that target micro level interventions is much more difficult than the West?
Let's take the second question together. Okay with you?
Sure.
That's a very good understanding of this issue. I'm asking something on the policy aspect context of India. Among the different factors you mentioned, parenting of course would be very important in the context of India, especially controlling crime and health issues. But at this stage it is rather difficult given the poverty, lack of time, resources, education of parents. There's lot to be done on the public provision. If you compare a public school, municipality school, school here and a private school, there's a world of difference in the quality of it. Now, what is most positive thing I notice is the dynamism. But sadly, you are also drawing a ceiling on the cognitive level. Now, maybe it differs with the skills, but that's in fact, in relation to that, I'm just asking for your comments that what if we I'm asking as a layman, a parent and a mentor myself, that what about promoting apprenticeship, rather doing away with these hard and fast degrees and marks and all that you've spoken of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, So why not learn of the person through their work?
Yes. Let me take the second question first. First of all, as I was saying in the answer to the previous question, that what we found was that properly structured apprenticeships, properly structured work-based educational strategies that involve mentoring can be highly effective. We found that true. Even though job training traditionally conceived as a government program was not that effective because it was so disassociated from workplace-based incentives, and because it didn't involve intrinsic motivation of the child and teaching some of these other skills, that we actually found that you could do very well with mentoring. There's no question. And you could do well with things like apprenticeship. So I don't want to dismiss that as a strategy. In fact, it's the opposite. This paper, we found substantial benefits, long-term benefits, came from interventions. Many people now, although I think it's slightly misleading, people are saying, I don't want to repeat this to confirm it, but just to say, many people are saying that German economic success is a consequence of its apprenticeship program. I'm very hesitant to say that, by the way, because Germany has had this apprenticeship program for at least 60 years, and the German economy has gone through some very miserable periods. So I don't think it's just the apprenticeship program. But it is the case when you evaluate the apprenticeship program and give people proper incentives, that you do find that that kind of workplace-based education is very good. And it does get to the idea of capability. I think one of the dangers, like in the U.S., we have now a policy, public policy, that's been announced by the Obama administration, saying college for all. And this completely misses the point that there's a lot of variability among people. Now, I didn't use the word, but this outcome equation is really illustrating the notion of comparative advantage. So many people have different relative capabilities at different ages, and they're better suited for some tasks than the others. Not everybody should go to college. And I think there probably should be much less emphasis placed on cognition. So I don't want to say there's a ceiling on cognition, Because actually it depends on what you mean by cognition. Cognition can mean not just IQ, but it can also mean acquired knowledge. And acquired knowledge is unbounded. You can continue to learn. People continue to learn. You see that executives, people who are involved in medicine, accounting, law, will frequently be taking apprenticeship renewal programs that teach them, keep them updated in their own occupation for a very old age. But not everybody should go to college. I don't know the Indian system so well, but I do know that in the United States and in many countries, there's been such a heavy emphasis on what looks like classical formal education and a de-emphasis on what you might think is workplace-based education, apprenticeships, and so forth. I think that's a big mistake. China, I know, actually suffers from that. Like in many of the areas where they're suffering a substantial difficulty in the structure of where they're getting skill bias, they're getting new technology. So these new technologies are coming in from their investment partnerships, but they lack the skilled labor, which is like a medium skilled labor, to actually work with the technology that the Germans are bringing in, the Japanese and others as they open these new plants in China. So I think it's a general strategy, and certainly true in the United States, that when it's tried as successful, that we actually do encourage also what we call community college, which does involve this kind of workplace-based education coupled with a form of academic education. But I agree completely that there shouldn't be like a notion of a single goal. It's very easy for politicians to say that. But as I said earlier in the talk, when we looked at what the return to college education was, for certain groups of people it was negative. It was much better to just give them the money than to give them the education. It's just not well suited. But for certain kinds of training, they can be highly effective. I think we need to think about, but that's where the capability approach comes in. We need to think about this vector of capability. It's not just pure cognitive skill. It's not just pure abstract reasoning. It's the ability to work with your hands, to work creatively, to learn from a situation, to adapt, and to create. So that's why, I don't know if that answers your question. Now coming back to this other question, that had to do with the notion of micro. I may have been overstating the micro. I am primarily a microeconomist, but in these areas, for example, in healthcare, in education, there's a macro component to many of these policies. And certainly when you're asking about how you improve labor markets and so forth, when you reduce certain kinds of regulation, when you open certain kinds of opportunities to people, those are macro-based policies. So when you allow firms to have incentives, when you allow students to have incentives, those are policies that I see as a more aggregative level. But there's a big scope. When I said 50% of these capabilities, 50% of lifetime outcomes in the U.S. were determined by your skills and so forth at age 18. The other 50% is partly determined by macroeconomic conditions in terms of what aggregate policies would be in managing the economy and responding to aggregate opportunities and aggregate shocks. And there's a big role for that. And maybe I understate it. But so I've been focusing primarily on individual capabilities. But even there, the way they're delivered can be through large-scale, coordinated macro efforts. And I think that's important to emphasize, not just a pure micro-based notion. And it also suggests, though, in terms of evaluation, Dr. Chibber is very interested in this question of evaluation, that we should think not only of micro-based evaluation, but of macro-based evaluation. And the macro, I did some work earlier, late in the 1990s, a paper published in 1998, on looking at the effect of changing tuition, just reducing tuition policy, on economic inequality and on economic returns. And the important finding that came out of that line of work was, yes, if we account for the macro implications of this, what happens is we reduce tuition. That causes more children to go to school. Many more children going to school depresses the wages of college graduates. So then the question becomes, what's the true return? The true return was actually somewhat diminished by the fact that you produced this large number of people. It was more subtle even than that, because even though you produce a large number of people, it had productivity effects down the line, which could then actually still pay off. So even if the entry cohorts were made worse off, down the line, you could actually still get real benefit, not only from having a more educated workforce, but even those people who, even in a period of oversupply, entered a glut market, could still do well, because in the long term, the trends were favoring more educated workers. So I completely agree you want a general equilibrium approach. You don't want to just, and that's actually one of the dangers of looking only at micro experiments, but that's another lecture.
Thank you so much. I know we can go on with more. We could go on the whole night, I think. But what you just said is very important, because one of the ones that I'm very keen to look at is labor market policies and its effects on our manufacturing sector. But you know, there's so much that you have spoken, and we haven't. You know, we could go on and on this, but what you have highlighted is so important for us in India. Let me just summarize it to say we got it so wrong for 50 years, based on what I've heard from your insights. But we are now beginning to shift. We are beginning to address early childhood education, nutrition programs, early age, etc. I'm going to detail here, but the implementation still remains a huge problem in many of these areas. But I do believe, Professor Heckman, that having you come again and again, and having you entice you somehow to get more work, and I hope all these young people here listening today will be, you know, energized to take up some of these questions. We do have a problem of data. We don't have as good data as have in the US and other places. But I do think that many of the issues that were raised could make up several PhD thesis topics in this audience. And Professor Manoj Panda will ensure that at least IG and you know, my former classmate Santosh, who was head of the Delhi School of Economics, he and his colleagues there would also ensure that many D-School PhD theses would be on these subjects that you have just opened up a great window for many young people here. But we hope to see you again, and Mrs. Heckman, of course, and we hope that we will get so much of your firepower on some of our problems that we are going to tackling with the next government. So thank you so much. I now request Professor Golda to give the vote of thanks.
Respected Professor Heckman, esteemed Dr. Chipper, my colleague and Director IEG, Professor Panda, our most valued invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of IEG and on my own behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Professor Heckman for delivering the lecture. For the researchers of IEG and other researchers and academicians present here, it was indeed a great occasion. Chairman mentioned about your work on the human capital, and many of us here have used the Heckman correction or have taught that in the classroom while teaching econometrics. Professor Heckman today talked about capabilities, how investments can enhance capabilities, and what's the role of the parents. It was an interesting, excellent theory, but what is more important, and it has considerable policy significance, especially when we are thinking so much about creating more equal opportunities to the Indian people. All these will really be very useful to us. And particularly from the researcher's point of view on IEG, I think this gives us ideas as to what research we can do. And a big thank you to Dr. Ajay Chipper for sparing valuable time out of his very busy schedule to grace the occasion and chair the functions. He made very interesting observations, initially and at the end. and it's indeed an honor to have him here. I must express my deep sense of appreciation for the guests present, and particularly those who asked questions. Special thanks also to Mr. Heckman for being with us this evening. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our thanks to those individuals who have provided logistic support and done many other things to make this kind of event successful. I once again want to state that we are most grateful to Professor Heckman for delivering the lecture, and we thank you all for being with us in this evening. It's really a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. I now invite you all to dinner, which is being served in the lounge.
Yeah, please join us.